In football, belief is everything. Clubs believe that this year will be different. The signings will click and the project will finally come together. And then it doesn't. Sometimes it's the weight of expectations, sometimes it's the chaos behind the scenes, and sometimes everything just goes wrong at once.
We are being the worst team, maybe, in history of Manchester United.
Since 2000, every season has had one club that promised something more, but delivered far less. So join me as we look back season by season at the clubs who didn't just fall short, they left us asking how it went so wrong. Inter Milan's 2000-01 season had all the makings of a great comeback story. They hadn't won a league since 1989. The fans were desperate. In came Hakan Şükür, fresh off a wild goal-scoring run at Galatasaray, and big money was dropped on Francisco Fariñas and, believe it or not, a 20-year-old Robbie Keane, who somehow had gone from Coventry to the San Siro in one move. The squad? Absolutely stacked. Seedorf, Blanc, Vieri, Zanetti, even a young Pirlo was in the mix. So where did it all go so wrong? Well, it all started with Marcello Lippi. After a poor start, he was sacked in October and his replacement, Marco Tardelli. His biggest experience was managing Italy's under-21s and a brief Serie B stint. Bold choice. Instead of challenging for the title, they watched Francesco Totti's Roma lift it instead. Inter Milan finished in a very disappointing 5th place. No trophies to be won, but a real humiliation came later. May 11th, 2001, the Milan derby. Inter Milan lost 6-0 to their biggest rivals. Their worst derby loss ever. Fans lost it, literally. A scooter was thrown from the stands after another loss to Atalanta, and banners reading shame covered the stadium. And in Europe, somehow things got even worse. They didn't even make it to the group stage. They were knocked out by Helsingborg. Honestly, I had to Google who they were, and that pretty much tells you everything. If you thought Inter's collapse was bad, Fiorentina's was a full-blown nightmare. In the late 90s, they had one of the most feared attacks in Europe. Rui Costa pulling the strings, top 6 regulars, Champions League football, but by the end of 2002, the club wasn't just losing games, it was losing everything. After brutal financial mismanagement by their owner, they were forced to sell both Rui Costa and their goalkeeper Toldo. And then when their top striker Chiesa got seriously injured, things were looking pretty bleak. That left Roberto Mancini, yes, that Mancini, with an impossible job. It was actually his first job of management and he lasted just 9 games. Fiorentina dropped straight into the relegation zone and never got out. They finished 17th, second bottom, conceded 63 goals, just 22 points in 34 games. And then came the real disaster.
Bankruptcy!
They didn't just drop to Serie B, they ceased to exist. They were forced to reform as Florentina Viola and restarted in Serie C2. Imagine Arsenal being liquidated and starting again in League 2. That's what happened, and even the 40 million sale of Rui Costa couldn't save them. That's just how deep this hole was. Just 2 years earlier, Leeds were in a Champions League semi-final. It was a young, fearless squad. Rio Ferdinand, Viduka, Kuhl and more. But it was all built on loans, massive loans. Gambling on regular Champions League qualification. But when they finished 5th in the 01-02 season, there was no Champions League money to be had and the collapse had just begun. Terry Venables was brought in, but he never really stood a chance. The debts were huge and key players had to be sold. Ferdinand went to United, Woodgate to Newcastle and Robbie Keane to Spurs. The fans didn't want it, the players didn't want it, and Venables certainly didn't want it, but the board did it anyway. And if you're looking to kill your team morale, sell your team's spine mid-season. Leeds barely avoided relegation, just 3 points clear, thanks mostly to Viduka's goals. But everybody knew it was only delaying the inevitable. They were 100 million in debt, relegated in 2004, then again in 2007 to League One. They didn't go down this season, but this was just the beginning of a 16-year exile from the Premier League. Zidane, Ronaldo, Beckham, Figo, Raul, Roberto Carlos, Galacticos everywhere. But this season proved a brutal truth. Superstars don't win titles on their own. When Florentino Perez took over, he had one mission: build a team of global icons. Figo came in 2000, Zidane in 2001, Ronaldo in 2002 and Beckham in 2003. The most talented and marketable squad on the planet. On paper, unstoppable, but on the pitch, a marketing machine with no balance. And the turning point came in summer 2003. Madrid sold Claude Makelele. Quiet, unglamorous, but absolutely vital. Zidane summed it up perfectly. Why put another coat of gold paint on the Bentley when you're losing the engine? Makelele went to Chelsea and Madrid never recovered. By spring they were the title favourites in the Copa del Rey final and the Champions League quarter-finals. But then came the collapse. Out to Monaco in Europe and beaten by Zaragoza in the Cup. And then 5 straight league losses to finish 4th. In just 60 days, Madrid went from chasing a treble to finishing the season with nothing. These 2 seasons looked like a complete success. Back-to-back titles and total dominance. But beneath the surface, it was chaos. You've probably heard the term Calciopoli, the 2006 match-fixing scandal. It essentially involved rigging certain referee appointments to benefit certain clubs, and Juventus were at the very heart of it. Now looking at their squad, the dominance made complete sense. Ibrahimovic, Cannavaro and Emerson had just joined, and Del Piero, Buffon, Trezeguet and Nedved were all still there. Fabio Capello was in charge and had built a ruthless, efficient machine, just sadly not one he could recreate at England many years later. But we're not here to talk about how good Juventus were. Now this story could have a video of its very own, but let me just break it down real quick. It was a scandal that broke by accident. Phone taps from a doping investigation revealed members of the Juventus board influencing which referees got which games. No bribes were proven, but referees were suspected of complying out of fear. Now by the time this had all come out in 2006, Juventus had already won the league. The Serie A board had a massive crisis on their hands. And the result? Juventus were stripped of their titles and relegated to Serie B. A huge scandal that didn't just affect Juventus. It had essentially completely reshaped Italian football. This is a team that should have gone down. The form was dreadful, the dressing room a mess. But somehow West Ham survived one of the most controversial seasons in Premier League history. And it all started right after the 2006 World Cup. Argentina had just been knocked out by Germany, but 2 stars stood out, Javier Mascherano and Carlos Tevez, both just 22 years old and full of potential. So when they suddenly turned up at West Ham, it made 0 sense. And yes, that is Alan Pardew signing Tevez and Mascherano. Mental. But the weirdest part? They weren't fully owned by West Ham. Instead, they were partly owned by some shady investment companies. And West Ham had conveniently forgotten to mention that when submitting the contracts to the Premier League.
I don't know. I think that's a bit dodgy, mate.
They got charged, obviously. But for the Sheffield United fans who ended up relegated, that wasn't really the point. Because it was the goals from Carlos Tevez who saved West Ham. He had a really slow start, but he finally hit form in March, scoring 7 in just 10 games, which included a final day match winner at Old Trafford. West Ham stayed up and Sheffield United went down. They may have survived, but let's be real, this season was a massive failure. The season before they had finished 9th, and with the 2 Argentina internationals, the goal was Europe. But instead, they scraped by in a relegation scrap. They had David Villa, David Silva, Juan Mata and Joaquin, some of Spain's finest talents. Expectations? A Champions League push, maybe even an outside chance of a title. But instead, Valencia completely imploded. Quique Sanchez Flores was entering his 3rd season. David Villa was at his peak, Silva was emerging as a world-class talent, and young Juan Mata had just arrived from Real Madrid. This was supposed to be the year they closed that gap on Real Madrid and Barcelona. But after a slow start, Flores was sacked. And when Ronald Koeman stepped in, things really started to unravel. You see, Koeman brought discipline, but completely misread the dressing room. He lost the players, the fans, the media fast. But despite the chaos, Valencia somehow won the 2008 Copa del Rey. But just days later, they were fighting relegation. A trophy lift on Wednesday and a survival scrap by Sunday. After winning the cup, they lost 5 of their next 6 games. Koeman was sacked in April when their team was just 2 points above the relegation zone. And this was a side that finished 4th the year before and reached a Champions League quarter-finals. Thankfully for them, a caretaker manager stepped in and won 3 of their last 4 games. They ended the season 10th, but it very easily could have been 18th. They may have won silverware, but it only really papered over the cracks. 3 managers, no identity, and total chaos. Newcastle is a city that lives and breathes football, and in 2008, things were looking pretty hopeful. They had a decent squad. Michael Owen, Obafemi Martins, Mark Viduka, and they had just finished 12th under Kevin Keegan. And Mike Ashley, their owner, was promising fans a new era. But that new era fell apart instantly. Keegan ended up quitting just after 3 games. The reason? He was furious that Ashley had essentially been signing players behind his back. Keegan wasn't allowed to do his job, and that's when the Ashley out movement began. Newcastle went through 4 managers in 1 season. After Keegan came Chris Hughton, then Joe Kinnear, and finally with 8 games left, club legend Alan Shearer. but by then it was pretty much too late. The final day summed it all up. An own goal by Damien Duff and a 1-0 loss to Aston Villa. Newcastle were relegated for the first time since 1989, and this squad should have stayed up. Owen, Martins, Duff and Zogbia Colaccini, all clearly good Premier League talent. But the season was riddled with injuries, dressing room drama and of course Joey Barton being Joey Barton.
You bellend.
At the time, Alan Shearer said it best: the club is broken. The season before, Liverpool were flying. Second of the league, just 4 points behind champions Manchester United. Going into the 09-10 season, the goal was clear: win the title. But instead of building on that momentum, they actually weakened the squad. And the biggest blow? Xabi Alonso sold to Real Madrid. When Madrid come calling, it's hard to say no, but their replacement, Alberto Aquilani, was nowhere near up to the standard. He was injured most of the year, and when he did play, it was pretty underwhelming to say the least. Liverpool usually thrive in Europe, but even the Champions League this year was a disaster. They finished third in a group they really should have won, and were knocked out of Europe even before the round of 16. It was the season that marked an end of an era for Rafa Benitez, the very man who delivered that famous 2005 Champions League trophy. He left at the end of the season, Mascherano also wanted out, and Fernando Torres looked well on his way too. They finished 7th in the league, never looked close to getting any silverware, and what followed was one of the most uncertain periods in Liverpool's history. Now, if you're a younger football fan, you might not know much about Deportivo, but for over a decade, they were one of Spain's top clubs. The Liga champions in 2000, regulars in Europe, and even Champions League semi-finalists. But this was a season when it all came crashing down. Just 7 years after that European run, they were relegated into the second division. The year before, they finished 10th. Underwhelming, yes, but no one expected what followed. Miguel Angel Latina was still in charge, known for his defensive style that had once stabilised the club, but by 2010, his tactics felt outdated. They managed just 31 goals in 38 games. On the final day, they needed a win against Valencia, but they lost 2-0 and fans were left in tears. Latina stepped down, budget cuts followed, and Deportivo never fully recovered. And as of today, they just finished 15th in the second division of Spain. I think this pretty much tells you just how far they've fallen, and who knows how long it will take them to get back to where they once were, and if they even will at all. Liverpool fans, I swear I don't hate you, but this season was another disaster and I've got to talk about it. In January 2011, Torres was sold to Chelsea for a then record of £50 million. At the time, it was a massive deal, and Liverpool went on a spending spree that's gone down in infamy. In came Andy Carroll for £35 million, Jordan Henderson, Stuart Downing and Charlie Adam. Big spending, but even bigger disappointment. They ended up finishing 8th, their lowest ever in the Premier League. Andy Carroll scored just 4 league goals, and as for Stuart Downing, 0 goals and 0 assists. When Liverpool is scoring fewer goals in Norwich, something has gone truly wrong. In the Cups, they actually performed pretty well. They did win the Carling Cup and reach an FA Cup final, but lost to Chelsea. And that wasn't enough to save Dalglish's job. 8th place simply wasn't acceptable, and the Brendan Rodgers rebuild just began. We're staying in England for this one, and if you thought Liverpool spent bad, QPR took it to a whole nother level. This season was such a disaster, it really should have its own video. After just about surviving relegation, owner Tony Fernandes vowed they would never be put in that position again. His solution? Buy an entirely new team. QPR started the season with a new manager and practically a new starting 11. No strategy, just a chaotic mix of panic buys and washed up names. Are you ready for this? In came Park Ji-sung, Granero, Boswinga, Julius Caesar, Junior Hoyler, Andrew Johnson, Fabio Nelson, Rob Green, Loic Remy, Chris Samba, Jermaine Genus and Andros Townsend.
Damn.
Now there's some decent names there, but there is no chemistry. Mark Hughes started the season and went winless in 12. He was sacked in November and in came Harry Redknapp to sort out the mess. QPR didn't win a game until matchday 17 and finished rock bottom with 25 points. The club was a circus. Massive egos and no effort. Boswinga even famously refused to sit on the bench and laughed after they were relegated. They had one of the league's highest wage bills. They lost 65 million in the process and even got hit with some financial fair play fines. It was one of the Premier League's most expensive failures ever. Now, if you're wondering why I look slightly different here, it's because the moment I mentioned Manchester United in this list, my footage decided to corrupt.
Very suspicious.
But don't worry, I'm not letting United off the hook just yet. Ferguson was gone, Moyes was in. And the dynasty was over before it even started. After 26 years of dominance, Manchester United faced a new era. David Moyes, handpicked by Sir Alex Ferguson, was meant to be the chosen one. But the boots were too big. Van Persie, Rooney, Carrick, De Gea, all champions just months ago. But without Ferguson's aura, the belief evaporated. The style? Cautious, predictable and uninspiring. United finished 7th. No title charge, no top 4, and knocked out of both domestic cups early. And as for Europe, Bayern Munich ended any hopes in that. Old Trafford was just no longer a fortress. West Brom, Everton, Newcastle and Sunderland all left with wins. The fans booed and the banners flew. The chosen one became a meme. The breaking point? A 3-0 loss at home to Liverpool. And at the final whistle, United just looked broken. Spirit, identity and purpose just all gone. David Moyes lasted just 10 months. From champions to chaos, one season was just all it took. And little did United fans know that that was just a taste of things to come. Our first German club on the list is Dortmund. And from 2010 to 2013, they were the most exciting team in Germany. Back-to-back Bundesliga titles and a Champions League final under Jurgen Klopp. High press, high energy and high expectations. But all good things must come to an end. When Bayern poached Mario Götze and Robert Lewandowski, the cracks started showing. But Dortmund reinvested and the squad was still strong. The fans expected a title race and not a collapse. But by Christmas they were second bottom with just 15 points. Injuries to Royce, Hummels and Gundogan left them without a strong starting 11. And the mobile who was brought in to replace Lewandowski was badly off the pace. They kept losing by fine margins, but it was all starting to add up. Critics would say Klopp's style wasn't working and he was failing to adapt. Even Klopp himself admitted, "I tried everything I knew and none of it worked." Calls for him to step down grew, but he decided to stay. And it proved to be the best thing for them. After the winter break, form picked up, Aubameyang had finally hit his stride, and Dortmund had climbed all the way back to 7th place. It was Klopp's worst and last season, but despite it all, he still walked away a hero. Chelsea were kings of Europe, ruthless, relentless and untouchable. Mourinho had just led them to a Premier League title with ease. 87 points and Eden Hazard looking like one of the best players on the planet. So the expectations for this season? Back-to-back titles and a serious Champions League push. But with Mourinho, there's always a ticking clock. And the chaos started on the very first day. Team doctor Eva Canaro ran on to treat Eden Hazard late in the match with Chelsea already down to 10 men. But her intervention meant that Hazard had to step off the pitch, leaving Chelsea with 9. Mourinho was furious. After the match, he publicly criticised her, claiming she didn't understand the game. The backlash was instant. The doctor left and lawsuits followed. And the atmosphere at Chelsea had just turned toxic after the very first game of the season. Chelsea's form had completely collapsed. Just 2 wins in their first 10 games. By December, they were only 1 point above the relegation zone. Eden Hazard, last season's Player of the Year, didn't even score till April, and Fabregas and Diego Costa had fallen off completely. Rumours of dressing room arguments and leaks started dominating the headlines. Mourinho had lost the players, and once that happens, it's over. After a 2-1 loss to Leicester, he was sacked. Gus Hiddink took over, but it was essentially damage control. Chelsea finished 10th, their worst league finish since 1966. They became the first Premier League champion to finish in the bottom half. But luckily for Chelsea, that record didn't last long, because Leicester's title defence was somehow even worse. They went from the 5,000-1 champions to battling relegation just months later. Now, no one expected a repeat, but nobody expected this either. By February 2017, they were just 1 point above the relegation zone. And just 9 months after doing the impossible, Claudio Ranieri was sacked. A move that shocked the football world. How do you sack the man who pulled off the greatest underdog story ever? But not all the blame could be on him. Kante, the engine of the team, was sold off to Chelsea, Vardy went 15 games without scoring, and Riyad Mahrez just looked completely uninterested. Strangely enough though, while struggling in the league, Leicester actually managed to top their Champions League group. They even reached the quarter-finals, but that only really distracted them from the real battle that was survival. After the severe defeat in Europe, Ranieri was out. The assistant coach Craig Shakespeare took over, and Vardy had actually managed to rediscover some form. They eventually managed to pull clear, finishing on 12th with 44 points. But when you go from champions to sacking the most legendary manager you'll ever have, that's a disappointment no matter how you spin it. We've already had Inter on this list, so it's only fair AC Milan get a mention too. And this was supposed to be the start of a new era. New ownership, a massive spending spree, and a return to glory. But instead, it was chaos and confusion. In April 2017, Milan were bought by Chinese businessman Li Yonghong, and he promised to take the club back to the very top. And that summer, over 200 million euros was spent. 11 new players arrived, 11. But Montella, who had just won the Supercoppa, couldn't make it work. Big money, no chemistry, same old story. He was sacked in November and replaced by Gattuso, a club legend with all the passion in the world, but very little experience. Milan crashed out of Europe to Arsenal and finished 6th in the Serie A. The whole thing felt rushed. The expectations were sky high, but the club wasn't quite ready for that comeback just yet. Coming into the season, Monaco looked like the only team who could rival PSG. In 2017, they won the league, reached the Champions League semi-final, and scored 107 goals. This was Monaco's golden generation. And then came the fire sale. They basically had a Lamborghini, but sold the wheels, the engine, and everything else. Mbappe went to PSG, Silva and Mendy to City, Bakayoko to Chelsea, Fabinho to Liverpool, Lemar to Atletico Madrid, and Moutinho to Wolves. I know it's their business model, but it came at a massive cost. They went 19 games without a win, from Europe's most exciting team to Liga 1's biggest liability. Title-winning coach Leonardo Jardim was sacked, and in came Thierry Henry. A legend on the pitch, but his managerial career had barely even got started. He had never even managed a senior team, and it was showing. The results were a disaster. And then in a bizarre twist, just 104 days later, Henry was sacked and Jardim was rehired. Mental. Even the big money signings didn't click, and by March they were 19th and facing relegation. Jardim shifted to a defensive setup and barely saved them. Just 2 points above the drop, and it was enough to keep them up. Monaco had built a title-winning team on youth and talent, but when they cashed in, they forgot to rebuild. From a Champions League final to sacking a beloved manager, this was the end of an era at Spurs. Pochettino had built something special. Kane, Son, Eriksen and Dele Alli all in their prime. But after coming so close to the ultimate prize, things started to fall apart. Poch admitted the squad needed a rebuild, but it never came. A 7-2 humiliation by Bayern Munich and a League Cup exit to League 2 Colchester marked the beginning of the collapse. Week after week it got worse. Poch looked exhausted, and after 5 years, Spurs finally pulled the plug. In came Mourinho, the serial winner. Expectations, a trophy. But in reality, they were knocked out of the FA Cup by Norwich, battered 4-0 by Leipzig in Europe, and there were countless public fallouts with players. What started as a potential title challenge turned toxic. They limped to a 6th place finish, so not a complete disaster, but nowhere near what fans were hoping for. I was tempted to say Spurs again for this season after sacking Mourinho just 2 days before a cup final, but this one isn't actually close. Schalke's season was a complete nightmare. And this isn't just any club. Schalke are Bundesliga giants. 7-time German champions, regulars in Europe, and a massive fan base. But after years of poor leadership and horrible transfer decisions, the club was drowning in debt. And then came the collapse. Rock bottom, dead last. Just 16 points from 34 games, a minus 61 goal difference. They went through 5 managers and the team was just unwatchable. Their top goal scorer, 19-year-old American Matthew Hopp, with 6 goals. I think that pretty much says it all. PSG had built a super team. In came Sergio Ramos, Donnarumma, Wijnaldum, Hakimi, Nuno Mendes, and of course, Lionel Messi. It looked like FIFA career mode and felt like the Galacticos 2.0, but on the pitch, it never truly clicked. With Messi, Neymar and Mbappe, they had the best front three in the world. A team that should have been untouchable, and the goal was clear, Champions League or nothing. But instead, they crumbled. A 17-minute Benzema hat-trick sent them crashing out against Madrid, and from there it all unravelled. Fans booed Messi and Neymar, and Mbappe looked ready to join Real Madrid. You can sign superstars and chase the hype, but football will always punish teams with no balance. This was the season that Roman Abramovich was forced to sell Chelsea, and in came American billionaire Todd Boehly. His approach? Picture a kid in a sweet shop. He essentially just grabbed whatever caught his eye. Over 600 million was spent and over 15 players were signed. Too many to list or we'll be here all day. Tuchel was still in charge at the time but clashed with Boehly over transfers. So in came Graham Potter for his very first shot at a big club. But when your squad's so bloated they can't even fit in one dressing room, you've got a serious problem. You might think more options sounds like a good thing, but to win a Premier League you need cohesion. Instead, Chelsea had cliques. no chemistry and unhappy players. Potter didn't last long and Lampard came back and somehow made it even worse. They finished with just 38 goals, the same as Erling Haaland had done alone. They slumped to 12th place, their worst finish since 1994. It was another reckless spending spree and another disaster. And it's becoming hard to say if these owners will ever learn. The season before, Napoli were unstoppable under manager Spalletti. 90 points, 77 goals and their first Serie A title since 1990. But heading into the 23-24 season, Spalletti had left for the Italy job and Rudy Garcia was the surprise and uninspiring appointment. And things went bad quick. Osimhen had public issues with the club, including a bizarre, now infamous TikTok that Napoli themselves had actually put out. A shocking move considering he was their hero just a few months earlier. Results kept slipping and they ended up going through 3 different managers. Napoli tumbled to 10th place and it was a harsh reminder that staying on top is even more difficult than reaching there. And finally we come to this season and there's no prizes for guessing who wins this one. Manchester United. The season started under Ten Hag, but after a horrible start he was replaced by Ruben Amorim. And I think it's fair to say fans were pretty hopeful. No one knew too much about Amorim, but a young fresh manager felt like it was needed. However, we all know how this one went. A 15th place finish, their worst ever in the Premier League and the lowest since 1974. The FA Cup and League Cup were a disaster, but the Europa League was Ruben's get out of jail free card. A win in Europa would allow them a place in the Champions League next season despite a woeful performance in the league. All that was needed was to beat Ange's Spurs in the final, who were somehow performing even worse than them. The final though summed up their whole season. It was a seriously underwhelming performance where they barely even threatened Spurs' goal. Garnacho's future now looks in doubt. Antony went from a disaster at United to a hero at Betis, and veterans like Casemiro and Eriksen look finished. In response to an awful season, United have started to rebuild. So we'll have to see how Ruben gets on next season. And that's it, every season since 2000 covered. Now if you're tired of hearing me rattle through some disappointing seasons, you should watch this video I've done covering Wrexham, who had the complete opposite. Thank you for watching, please like and subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one.